Yes, it's Dr. Noel again. Just gonna give you guys kind of a quick rundown on this week, on week one here. First part of it is we try to get these out of the way first and go ahead and drop in a little bit of an introduction about yourself, give me a little bit of information about who you are, where you're from, what your goals are, or your reasoning for being in the master's program. And give me a little bit of whether this is your first course or where you are in the master's program. That just kind of helps me out a little bit and lets me know where you're at, because this could be either your first course or it could be your third course. Just not quite sure which it is. So that helps me out a little bit. We have 3 discussion questions this week. And the first one is it's a reflection on an ethical decision you made. So ethics or a moral decision can be anything along the lines of something that you've struggled with that might have had some implications going if from an ethical standpoint or morality standpoint. For instance, there's some ethical decisions as to whether in business, for instance, in my world, would I overcount my inventory because it would make me look better from a cost percentage, or would I just let the numbers roll as they were? Now, mind you, I'd let the numbers roll as they were because it's never a good idea to overinflate your inventory. But that is an example of an ethical decision. It could be one that you had in business or one that you had in your personal life. And then just kind of talk yourself through what approaches you used. You're going to have some approaches in a little bit in chapter 3 there that we're going to be talking about. So that way we can go ahead and so take a look at those inside the book and kind of think about the approaches you used. Evaluate how effective they were in evaluating that decision. And what did you learn about that? So then we're going to go into number 2. The next one, question 2 is how would you respond when somebody makes this the decision that adversely affects you while saying it's nothing personal, just business? And a good example of that I can give you is that, from my perspective, is walking in and getting a letter for a layoff, and my boss telling me it's nothing personal, it's just business. Well, that's sometimes when you reflect on those, it's sometimes not always just business. Sometimes there is some other morality issues behind that. So those are things that you kind of have to take a look at. One second here. So, when you make out this decision here, just think about how that would how you felt when those things happen. And if you haven't, think about what would happen if you were told that. Now, some of you just being in college, you may have not had that that saying said to you, but just think about how you would feel if you lost your job, for example, and your boss just says, well, it's nothing personal, it's just business. So how would you feel? How would you respond to that? And it'll be I love this question. So I'm hoping to see some good responses this week. The last one we got down here is discussion 3. And this is 6 to 8 virtues that you believe are important in the workplace, and you need to list them and explain. So a virtue, and you may have to look this up, virtues are kind of things that deal with morality and are guiding principles to morality, whether you're looking in the biblical sense or the philosophical sense or some other philosophical standard. They're all virtues. So you need to kind of take a look at that, read through some of the discussions in the book, and think about how what those would be that would be important. You need to list those and explain each one of those. This is one of those that you might have to research a little bit outside the book as well, especially if you don't have a lot of business background to draw on. So feel free to do that, but also make sure that you list your sources in the APA format. If you have problems with the APA format, you can reach out to me. I can certainly direct you towards the library. There's a few things in the bottom of this course shell as well on the homepage that you can look up and look at it, which is the Purdue OWL and a couple of other those things that you can, resources that you can use to actually list those and cite those in the proper format. So now I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the PowerPoint over here. And we're going to talk about a couple of things over here just to kind of, just to make sure that we're on the right place. I'm going to draw a couple of things out of the PowerPoint for you for the week. I'm not going to read them all to you. That's death by PowerPoint. So, but we're going to go, I'm going to go ahead and hit a couple of things. First, when you take a look at these here, we're going to talk about EDM. This is what ethical decision making. Okay, so when you refer to EDM, it's going to be talking about the ethical decision making process in a business. Okay, and as you look through here, there's a couple of things here I'm going to draw out, and then I'm going to skip down to them. And some of those, I'm not going to get into the philosophical approaches and frameworks, but I'm going to touch on those a little bit when we get to a couple of the diagrams down below. And then we are going to look at I'm going to go over some stakeholder impact analysis for you. And then, of course, then you have the non-quantifiable impacts for anybody who's familiar with the BP Gulf spill, Gulf oil spill, the Tylenol recall, or any number of the current situation in the aspect of cancel culture and how that could impact your business. You may have individuals who are working for you that could be my age, and we grew up in a different time frame, and now there is a big impact to businesses where those people in power are all of a sudden now things are coming out of the woodwork that could have a potential impact for the business and the reflection of those leaders on the business. So those are all about ethical decision making. So we're going to kind of go through just a couple of these. I'm going to kind of touch down here. Okay, and this is where we get into the kind of the comparison. EDM considerations, how well-being of the company. Okay, and this chart here kind of describes what on the left-hand side is the considerations that there were issues that there would be in relation to ethical decision making, and the right has the actual basis in philosophical theory. Okay, so well-being is considered to be a consequentialism, utilitarianism, or theology. Okay. And then you have the rights of shareholders, which fits in deontology, which is rights and duties of the company to the people who own it. Fairness amongst the stakeholders. Then you have that Kant was big into the aspect of justice as impartiality, and Kant's categorical imperative is fairness, and uniformity of the fairness. And then expectations for character traits and virtues, and that's a Carafo, which is a virtue. He was the guy who talked about virtues. So this is where you can find some of those virtues if you can't think about them. There is also some EDM issues, okay, that could affect your ethical decision making. For instance, different cultures where bribery is considered. You go to South America, or countries in Africa, even some countries in Eastern Europe, bribery is accepted and expected. In the U.S., it's not so much. So you're going to want to take a look at that, and we look at that as differences between cultures, and that really has its roots in relativism and subjectivism in ethical theory or philosophical theory. And then you have conflicts of interest, okay, or limits to self-interest and limits to interested behavior. Now, in most cases, as far as ethical decision-making is concerned, if you have a conflict of interest, you should be bowing out of that decision-making process. For instance, if I was to evaluate a school for accreditation, I really have to have no connection to that school whatsoever. You know, at one point I consulted with a school for accreditation, and I've consulted with a couple, but where they were going to be evaluated later, and I was actually offered the position to evaluate them, and I said I had to turn that down because I had a conflict of interest. Same in my other career where I do professional testing and licensure testing. If I know the person, I have to be devoid of any conflict of interest. So yeah, most of the time I don't evaluate people who I know. I have once or twice in the past, but only because of individuals who have made that request to me. However, then it's usually harder because I won't have anybody draw into question a conflict of interest. And I warn them about that up front. So this is kind of how this kind of works into making a good decision. These are kind of the expectations from a philosophical standpoint that you factor in based on the slide before when we talked about that. This is kind of what comes into play to make the best ethical decision. Now, do we always make that best ethical decision? Not always. But we try to, or you should. So then we're going to look at a little bit about stakeholders. Okay. So stakeholder identification of interests. So you have to identify who the stakeholders are in any particular decision and why which stakeholders are most important. Okay. So as you're looking through this aspect, really the sweet spot in the Venn diagram here, where you're looking at, it's this spot right here, where the urgency and the legitimacy and the power all come together. That's going to be your ideal ethical decision for all those involved. However, that's probably not going to be reality, and you're going to have to sometimes end up in these other areas over here where you might leave, over here you're leaving out legitimacy, for the sake of urgency and power. I'll give you an example there. For instance, in a stakeholder may have legitimate power, may have legitimacy here and a legitimate stake in this in an emergency situation. That legitimacy goes out the window in favor of power and urgency. So if you're in an emergency situation, the stakeholder legitimacy really doesn't play into it. So you're going to be in this area over here where you're working with urgency and power. Because in that case, obviously power and authority, you need to make sure that those decisions happen quickly and within a level of authority or power behind them. The legitimacy of the stakeholders in this case, other than in an emergency situation, the well-being of them is not going to play in as much into that decision-making process. So when we look at this one, okay, again, we're back to those philosophical questions. This is how you're measured and how well your ethical decision making works. Okay, profitable, benefits over costs, and was the risk adjusted? You have a fiduciary duty responsibility if you work for a company. And then on top of that, you have individual rights and you have fairness. Now, in this day and age, which one of those weighs wellness over the other? I would hope it would be fairness, but sometimes it seems to be individual rights these days. And you're more than welcome to debate that with me. Ethics is a great thing because we can certainly debate it and neither one of us be right or wrong. Then we have character, virtue expectations, character of the leader, the integrity, the courage, and the process. Not all ethical decisions are easy, which means you have to have sometimes the courage to make them, even though they may be the tough decision in the case. So when you take a look at some, so this here is a cost benefit analysis. And I think by this point, you probably have had that. You're going to, when we look at ethics and we look at this iceberg, okay, and the net present value versus the present value of the cost of each option. So in this iceberg, two-thirds of your iceberg is below water, 1/3 is above. Okay, so what you're going to have to do is, as that starts to shrink, okay, the amount of the iceberg will start to buoy up. So the net present value, okay, is going to be the present value of benefits minus the present value of costs. So sometimes this is more of an ethical situation rather than a hard, it's going to be a weighing of the benefits versus the cost of each item, okay? So even though we use the same formula, but it's not really a mathematical formula, it's more about, does the benefits outweigh the costs, okay? And those costs can be either intrinsic or extrinsic to the company. And what I mean by that is they can be internal, both benefits and costs, or which means they're internal to the company in relations to labor or some other production or those types of things. Or the cost of each option, which is going to be, which also, or the benefits could be outside the company in relations to positive press or goodwill or those types of things within the company, outside of the company. And the costs have that same type of ratio of inside and outside. So what you're doing when you make an ethical decision is weighing, you're using this net present value of what it's going to be today. So the net present value is if that's going to be positive. So when you weigh those, you weigh the positives versus the negatives, and you're going to come up with, okay, this seems to be a good decision, or realistically, it's a pretty good decision, or it may be the best decision you make at the time. All of those are all different things that you would consider. And just to kind of wrap up a little bit. So this is kind of, I want to draw your attention to this one here, which is where it kind of goes, this is the decision where you go through, okay? So what you start out with a preliminary decision. You preliminary assess this and see if, okay, what would happen if this decision were published? Would this be something that would be good for the company generally? Would your mother be proud of that decision? Those are all those kinds of things. Now, if you found something that wasn't quite right, then you go through a little bit more analysis. Okay, and you come down here to go, okay, where things are. Usually with an ethical decision, we get to this point, you pass the rule of thumb and all this, and your mother would be okay with it. Then you come down and this is what you do: you enact the decision. Okay. Now, if not, you've got a couple of things up here. Go, this is not quite the decision I wanted to make. Then you drop down in here and go, hey, let me go ahead and take a look at this more in depth. Then you look at all these things about how things play into fact. Is there virtues involved? Is there an impact on rights? Is it fair? Is it profitable? And then you kind of go through these, and if there are problems solved, if there's some problems in here still, then you come back up and revise that decision, and you come back around and kind of do this until you get to that point where you've kind of worked it out, and then you dump out over here to your final decision. Now, sometimes this happens literally in seconds or minutes. So it doesn't have to be an extensive process, but you really have to make yourself look at the way these are and the way you're making those decisions. Okay. And this would lead to what you would have is a good reputation. Okay. And this is the things that come into play with your corporate reputation. So this is kind of a SWOT analysis that they talk a little bit about those decisions and how they work within the organization. And this is, again, is something that you could do in literally seconds or minutes. Or it could be a much more involved decision if you're looking at changing the company's direction or those types of things. So both of these slides here, you could be doing very quickly, or it may be an extensive process over weeks or months, depending on what kind of decision you're making and what the level of that decision making process is. All right, I just thought I'd go ahead and touch base a little bit on where things are here. Like I said, the whole PowerPoint's here for you guys to take a look at. I'd go through and kind of take a look at the ethics and governance, ethical decision-making chapter. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.